If you stand on a ridge in Logan County, West Virginia, and just listen, all you'll hear is the wind moving through the pines. It feels ancient, peaceful. But 160 years ago, this silence was an illusion. It was a cover. In these very hills, a different kind of civil war was fought, a war of shadows and whispers, where your neighbor was more dangerous than any army. This valley was a hunting ground, and two men were the apex predators. One of them, you know, Devil Anse Hatfield. The other, his name has been swallowed by the fog of time. Today, we're peeling back that fog. We're here to find the story of Captain William Anderson, known to his men as Wall. He was the first man to wage a private war against Hatfield, a Union guerrilla chief whose personal crusade for a murdered friend would pour the foundation for the most infamous feud in American history. This ground remembers him, and if we listen close enough, it'll tell us his tale. Before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, life along the Tug Fork River followed a rhythm as old as the mountains themselves. It was a world of scattered log cabins, nestled in deep hollows, where a man's last name meant more than any flag. Here, loyalty wasn't given to a government in some far-off city. It was sworn to your kin, your clan. Life was a relentless cycle of planting, hunting, and surviving, carved out of the forest with an axe and a rifle. And in this world lived two young men, both forged from the same mountain grit, both natural leaders, and both named Anderson. The first was William Anderson. The records don't tell us much about his early life, but they tell us what he stood for. He was a Unionist through and through. For him, and many like him, the Confederacy was the creation of wealthy tidewater aristocrats, the same flatland politicians who had always looked down on the mountain people as backward and unimportant. The Union represented something purer, a nation of free men, not a society built on the backs of slaves. In a county that was bleeding secessionist sympathy, holding that belief wasn't just an opinion, it was a dangerous declaration. The other was Anderson Hatfield, a man whose charisma was as sharp as his aim. History would come to call him Devil Anse. He saw the world differently. To him, the war was about defending his home from a federal government that had no right to tell a man how to live. He was a product of his place and time, fiercely independent and deeply loyal to Virginia. When the state seceded, his loyalty went with it. He saw the Union as an invader, an enemy at his doorstep. Before the war, they were just neighbors in a sparsely populated county. They would have passed each other on the trail, perhaps traded stories or shared a mason jar of corn liquor at a local gathering. They understood the same unwritten laws of the mountains. But in 1861, the whole world changed. A line was drawn right down the middle of the Tug Fork Valley. Suddenly, you had to choose. Were you for the Union or for the Confederacy? There was no middle ground. Friendships soured overnight. Families were torn apart. The quiet suspicion that had always existed between neighbors began to curdle into a deadly hatred. This beautiful, rugged land, once a sanctuary, was about to become a slaughterhouse. William Anderson and Anse Hatfield, two men who might have been friends in another life, were now standing on opposite sides of a chasm, ready to lead their people into a war far more personal and brutal than anything happening on the famous battlefields of the East. History isn't always found on a bronze plaque. Sometimes the most powerful truths are hidden in plain sight, tucked away in a cardboard box in the basement of a county courthouse. That's where I found this. It's a digital copy of a fragile yellow document from the West Virginia State Archives, a military muster roll from 1862. The ink is faded, the names handwritten in a script that's almost art, but one entry is perfectly clear. At the top of a list of about 50 men, it reads, Captain William Anderson. This single piece of paper is the key. It makes him real, pulling him out of the realm of folklore and into official history. And it gives us the official name of his unit, the Logan County Home Guard. The name sounds so orderly, so defensive. It paints a picture of local men, deputized to protect their homes and keep the peace. A neighborhood watch with rifles, sanctioned by the new Union government of West Virginia. But that's the paradox, isn't it? No one in these hills passed down stories about the Home Guard. The name that was whispered with a mix of fear and reverence was the Logan Wildcats. To their enemies, they were known by an even more sinister name, the Snakes, a title that spoke of the way they fought, silent, sudden, and lethal. This official document is the sanctioned story, the clean version written for the men in Charleston and Wheeling. So this roll of names, this simple piece of paper, poses the critical question that unlocks our entire story. What turns a home guard into a band of feared guerrilla fighters? What events were so brutal, so personal, that they twisted a mission of defense into a campaign of vengeance? This document tells us who they were on paper. Now, we have to find out who they were in the flesh and in the blood. That muster roll wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a hunting license. With the official blessing of the new Union government of West Virginia, Captain Wall Anderson's mission was clear: to crush Confederate sympathy in Logan County. And in a war like this, that didn't mean fighting an army. It meant fighting your neighbors. Their first and most critical task was to disarm the local population known to be loyal to the South. In the mountains of Appalachia, this was more than a strategic move. It was a profound insult. A man's rifle wasn't just a tool, it was his provider, his protector, his symbol of independence. To have it taken from you, especially by men you grew up with, was an unforgivable violation. Imagine the scene. Anderson and his home guard ride up to a remote cabin, the smoke curling from its chimney. They aren't an invading army, they are familiar faces. They call the man of the house by his first name. But they are there to demand he surrender his long rifle and his squirrel gun, the very things he needs to feed his family and defend his home. They are acting under official orders, but to the family inside that cabin, this is nothing short of tyranny. This is how the war began here, not with a cannon blast, but with a tense standoff on a cabin porch. Of course, this aggression did not go unanswered. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And in Logan County, that reaction was Anse Hatfield. He watched as Anderson's men, his Unionist rivals, used the law as a weapon against his kin and his allies. In response, he gathered his own band of fighters, also known confusingly as the Logan Wildcats. They became the Confederate shadow to Anderson's Union force. If Anderson's men raided a secessionist farm for guns and supplies, Hatfield's men would retaliate, hitting a Unionist farm twice as hard. This was the true beginning of the conflict. It was a slow-burning fuse lit in the summer of 1862. It became a brutal, intimate cycle of retribution. A Unionist would wake to find his corn crib burned to the ground. A week later, a Confederate sympathizer would find his best mule gone, taken in the dead of night. Taunts were shouted across moonlit hollers. Men would vanish on lonely trails, their bodies found days later. The formal name, Home Guard, became a bitter joke. This is how they earned their real names. To the Union families they protected, they were the Wildcats, fierce and loyal. But to the families they terrorized, their tactics were more subtle, more sinister. They were said to move through the woods without making a sound, to strike from the laurel thickets without warning and melt back into the shadows. They were the Snakes. And Captain Wall Anderson, once just a neighbor, was now their leader, locked in a deadly chess match with Devil Anse Hatfield, where the pawns were their own people and the board was the land they all called home. The official record is a cold thing. It gives you names, dates, and causes of death, but it never tells you about the fear. To find that, you have to talk to the people who carry the stories in their blood. My search led me to a small house just outside of Matewan, to a man sitting on his front porch, whose great-great-uncle was Asa Harmon McCoy. He's one of the unofficial keepers of the valley's memory, a man whose quiet words carry the weight of 5 generations of pain. When I asked him about Harmon, he nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the distant ridgeline. The books will tell you he was a Union soldier killed by Confederate partisans, he said, his voice raspy with age. And that's true, far as it goes. But the story my grandpa always told me, it was a whole lot more personal than that. He explained that Harmon wasn't just a faceless enemy in a blue uniform. He was known. He had lived here his whole life. His enemies weren't strangers. They were the men he'd grown up with. According to the McCoy family law, the real trouble started when Harmon came home from the army. He was seen at the local grist mill by Jim Vance, Devil Anse Hatfield's uncle, a man known throughout the valley for having a temper as hot as a forge and a heart as cold as a stone. Vance looked Harmon up and down, taking in the blue uniform and the discharged soldier's limp, and said something that wasn't just a threat, but a prophecy. "The way my family tells it," the old man said, leaning forward in his chair. Vance looked him dead in the eye and said, "The buzzards will be picking at your bones before the winter's out." You see, that's the part the history books leave out. This wasn't a random act of war. It was a death sentence delivered in public. Harmon knew Jim Vance, and he knew that Vance wasn't a man for idle threats. The family story insists that Devil Anse Hatfield himself had given his blessing to this kind of intimidation, telling his men to make life a living hell for any McCoy who had sided with the Union. Harmon McCoy was now marked. He was a man being hunted, not by an army, but by his own neighbors. This is the human truth that breathes life into the cold facts. The story passed down on this porch explains the terror that followed, and it gives us the emotional key to what happens next. It wasn't politics anymore. It was personal. And for Wall Anderson, hearing that his friend and comrade was being stalked like an animal by his sworn enemy's clan, it was about to become the point of no return. The winter of 1864 was a bitter one in the mountains. The war was grinding to its bloody conclusion, but in the Tug Fork Valley, the hatred burned hotter than ever. Asa Harmon McCoy, home from the Union Army with a broken leg, knew the threat against him was real. He didn't dare sleep in his own bed. He found a small, cold cave in the hills above his cabin, a place where he thought he would be safe. His wife and a loyal family slave named Pete would sneak food and blankets to him under the cover of darkness. For weeks, he lived like a hunted animal, listening to every snap of a twig, watching every shadow. His chief protector during this time was Captain Wall Anderson. Anderson saw Harmon's situation not just as a threat to one of his men, but as a direct challenge from Devil Anse Hatfield. He vowed to keep Harmon safe. Anderson's wildcats would patrol the ridges around the McCoy property, a silent, unseen shield. For a time, it worked. The presence of Anderson's feared guerrilla fighters kept the Hatfield clan at bay. A tense, fragile stalemate settled over the valley, a cold war fought with watchful eyes and loaded rifles. But the stalemate couldn't last. In the first week of January 1865, the fragile peace was shattered. A critical message reached Wall Anderson. A major force of Confederate cavalry was sweeping through the region, and his unit was needed to counter them. It was a legitimate military order he could not ignore. With a heavy heart, Anderson gathered his men and rode out, leaving the hollows around Harmon's homestead temporarily unguarded. He likely warned Harmon to be extra cautious, to stay hidden until he returned. It was a calculated risk, but a necessary one. This was the moment Jim Vance had been waiting for. With Anderson and his snakes gone, the valley was his. He gathered a band of Hatfield partisans, men who shared his burning hatred for the Unionist McCoys. On the morning of January the 7th, a fresh blanket of snow covered the ground, and in that snow, they found what they were looking for, a single set of tracks leading from the McCoy cabin up into the hills. It was Pete, the slave, bringing breakfast to his master's hiding place. They had their trail. The hunt was on. They tracked Pete to the cave. What happened next was not a battle, it was an execution. They found Harmon McCoy, wounded and alone, and shot him where he lay. The sound of the gunfire echoed through the cold, empty hollow. There was no one there to hear it, no one left to protect him. The promise Jim Vance had made at the grist mill had been kept. By pulling his men away for a larger fight, Wall Anderson had inadvertently left the door open for his enemy. When he returned and found Harmon's body, his sense of duty would have curdled into a furious, guilt-ridden desire for vengeance. The war was no longer about flags or politics. It was about a debt of blood that would be paid to the Hatfield clan. To understand what happened next, you have to come here, to the place where the official records fall silent. This is the hollow where Asa Harmon McCoy made his home. There's nothing left of his cabin now, just a flat patch of earth that nature is slowly reclaiming. It's not an easy place to get to. The hills rise up around you like fortress walls, steep and choked with rhododendron. This is a landscape that swallows sound, a place that can make a man feel utterly alone. And in the winter of 1865, that isolation was a weapon used against him. The physical evidence of Harmon's last stand isn't a bullet hole in a wall or a scorch mark on the ground. It's the land itself. Up there, on that ridge, the hillside is riddled with shallow caves and rock outcroppings. The exact one where he hid is lost to legend, and in a way, that makes the story even more chilling. It could have been any of them. I'm standing at the mouth of one now. It's cold, damp. Water drips from the rock, and the only sound is the wind at my back. It feels like a sanctuary, a perfect hiding place, but it's a trap. There's only one way in and one way out. This is where the hunt ended. Imagine that morning, January 7th, 1865. A fresh coat of snow covers everything, a perfect, clean slate. And on that canvas, a set of footprints, left by the slave Pete as he carried food up this very hillside. He was an act of loyalty, an act of human decency in the middle of a brutal war. But Jim Vance and his partisans saw those tracks not as a sign of loyalty, but as a map. Every step Pete took in that snow was a nail in Harmon McCoy's coffin. The land that was meant to hide him had betrayed him. The partisans didn't have to search, they just had to follow. Right here, on this unforgiving slope, the silence was about to be shattered. This cold stone hillside was about to become a tomb. Inside the cave, the cold was a physical thing, seeping through Harmon McCoy's clothes and settling deep in his bones. The only warmth came from a small, shielded fire that gave off more smoke than heat. He would have heard them coming, but not in the way you hear an army. There was no thunder of hooves, no battle cry. There was only the unnatural silence that falls over a forest when all the animals go quiet at once. A single bird, startled from a branch. A crunch of snow that was too heavy to be a deer. He was a woodsman. He knew the signs. The trap had been sprung. The men who surrounded the cave moved with the patience of wolves. They were shadows against the snow, their faces grim, their eyes hard. Jim Vance was at their head, his presence radiating a cold, implacable menace. There were no words spoken, no final taunts. The time for threats was over. This was the time for the prophecy to be fulfilled. They took their positions, a semicircle of rifles aimed at the dark mouth of the cave. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the bare winter trees. Then, the hollow exploded. A single rifle shot cracked the silence, its report echoing off the rock faces like a clap of thunder. It was followed instantly by a volley, a deafening roar of black powder and lead that ripped through the frigid air. The birds that had been hiding in the trees burst into the sky in a panic. The sound rolled down the valley, a brutal announcement that a debt had been collected. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. A profound silence fell, heavier and more complete than before. The only smell was the sharp, sulphurous tang of burnt gunpowder hanging in the air. The figures in the snow didn't linger. Their work was done. One by one, they turned and melted back into the trees, leaving behind nothing but their tracks and the deep, ringing quiet. When the first search party, led by Harmon's family, finally made their way up the treacherous hillside hours later, they were met with that same chilling silence. They saw the disturbed snow, the dozens of footprints circling the cave. Inside, the meager fire had burned down to embers. A tin plate with a piece of cornbread lay overturned on the dirt floor. The air was still thick with the ghost of violence. They didn't need to see the full horror to understand what had happened. The message, delivered with such brutal finality, was clear. This wasn't an act of war. This was murder. And it was a message intended not just for the McCoys, but for their protector, Captain Wall Anderson. After a crime so brutal, you expect to find a paper trail. You expect to see the machinery of justice, however slow and imperfect, begin to turn. So, I went to the Logan County Courthouse archives, to the massive leather-bound ledgers where the county's business was recorded. The pages are thick and brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. You can smell the history on them, a century and a half of dust and decay. I was looking for one thing, an indictment for the murder of Asa Harmon McCoy. I turned the fragile pages, past land disputes and lawsuits over stolen pigs, to the entries for January of 1865. My finger traced the elegant handwritten script, searching for the names. Vance, Hatfield, anyone from the partisan band. I was looking for a warrant, a coroner's report, a magistrate's note, anything to show that the law recognized that a man had been hunted down and killed in a cave. But there is nothing. It's not just a lack of a conviction, it's a lack of any record whatsoever. The official legal account of January 7th, 1865 is a complete and total silence. It's as if Asa Harmon McCoy simply ceased to exist. His murder, an event that would ignite a feud for the next 30 years, is a ghost in these pages. The ink of the law never touched it. This is where you have to learn to read between the lines, to see the story in the empty space. That silence is more damning than any written verdict. It tells you that in Logan County, the official law was either powerless or complicit. It tells you that men like Jim Vance and the Hatfield clan operated with impunity, their influence so strong that the local courts wouldn't dare cross them. The system had failed, and when the official law turns a blind eye, another, older law takes its place. The law of the mountains, the law of blood for blood. For Captain Wall Anderson, this empty page in a courthouse ledger would have been the final confirmation. There would be no trial. There would be no justice from a judge in a black robe. He and his wildcats would have to become the judge, the jury, and the executioner themselves. The hunt was on, but it wouldn't be the sheriff leading it. When the law refuses to write the story, men with guns write it for them. For Captain Wall Anderson, that silent ledger in the Logan courthouse was not an ending. It was a declaration of war. If the official system would not pursue Asa Harmon McCoy's killers, then he would. The mission of the Logan Wildcats changed that day. It was no longer about defending the Union or disarming sympathizers. It was now a single, burning objective: to hunt down Jim Vance and every man who had followed him up that snowy hill. Justice would not be found in a courtroom. It would be delivered from the barrel of a rifle. The manhunt that followed was a terrifying affair. Anderson's snakes were masters of this terrain. They knew every trail, every hidden pass, every creek bed that could hide a man's tracks. They began a relentless campaign of pressure against the Hatfield clan. Men known to have been part of the death squad found themselves stalked. A trip to the grist mill became a life-or-death gamble. The woods around their homes, once a source of comfort, now held an unseen menace. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow at dusk could be one of Anderson's men waiting. There was no formal courtroom, but the mountains themselves became the venue for a trial by terror. Anderson's men would appear on a ridge overlooking a Hatfield allied farm, just standing there, a silent, ominous promise. They conducted lightning raids, not for supplies, but for information. trying to squeeze the location of Vance out of his friends and family. The cycle of retribution that had been simmering for years now boiled over. In response to the hunt, Devil Anse Hatfield fortified his own people. The Tug Fork Valley became a checkerboard of fear, where armed bands from both sides patrolled the hollers, and a chance encounter on a narrow trail could erupt into a bloody skirmish. There was no verdict read by a judge. The verdict was the scream of a rifle echoing through the night. It was the sight of a barn burning against the black sky. It was the constant, gnawing fear that your name was on a list, and that the man hunting you would not stop until the debt for his friend's murder was paid in full. The pursuit of Harmon McCoy's killers was never a legal process. It was a private war, a brutal vendetta that consumed the last months of the Civil War and laid a bloody foundation of personal hatred that would last for another 30 years. The law had failed, and in its place, the law of the gun reigned supreme. To understand how a war truly ends, you have to look at how the warriors themselves ended up. You have to walk among the dead. Here, in Logan County, just off the main road, is the Hatfield family cemetery, and you can't miss its centerpiece. High on a hill stands a life-sized marble statue of Devil Anse Hatfield, imported from Italy. He looks out over the valley he once ruled, defiant and proud even in death. It's not a headstone, it's a declaration. This is the final resting place of a man who lived a long life, died in his bed surrounded by family, and became a legend. A man who won. Then you cross the Tug Fork into Kentucky, and you find a different kind of grave. In a small, quiet family plot, you'll find the marker for Asa Harmon McCoy. It's a simple government-issue stone, the kind given to a soldier. It's humble, dignified, and tragically understated. It marks the end of a life cut violently short. They lie just a few miles apart now, the famous patriarch and the first victim, enemies in life, silent neighbors in death. But there's one man missing from this final roll call, the man who started the hunt, the man whose rage over Harmon's death set the whole feud in motion. Where is Captain William Wall Anderson? I've searched the old churchyards, the forgotten family plots overgrown with weeds, and the official records. There is no grave, no marker, no stone to say that he was ever here at all. Devil Anse is immortalized in marble, and his first victim has his soldier's stone, but their nemesis he has vanished from the earth as completely as a ghost in the morning mist. A man so central to this conflict, a man who burned with such a righteous fire, doesn't just disappear. His empty space on the landscape raises the final critical question that takes us back in time one last time. What happened to Wall Anderson? In April of 1865, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. For most of the country, the Civil War was over. But in the Tug Fork Valley, the news of peace was just a rumor from a world away. Here, the war had never been about North and South. It was about Anderson and Hatfield, McCoy and Vance. The official war was over, but the killing wasn't. Captain Wall Anderson's personal manhunt for the murderers of Asa Harmon McCoy continued into the summer, a bloody epilogue to the national conflict. His fury had not cooled. The historical record shows that sometime in that violent summer of '65, Anderson and his Wildcats cornered a group of Hatfield's men near a place called the Dry Fork of the Tug. A vicious firefight erupted. It was an ambush, a chaotic swirl of smoke and muzzle flashes among the dense trees. And in that final desperate skirmish, Wall Anderson's luck ran out. A Confederate ball, fired months after their cause was officially lost, tore through his side. His men managed to drive off the attackers and carry their badly wounded captain from the field, but the blow was a devastating one. And this, right here, is where the story of Captain William Wall Anderson fractures into legend. The official records fall silent. His name vanishes from the muster rolls. What happened next depends on who you ask, and which story has been passed down in their family. One version says he died of that wound. either slowly in a bed surrounded by his grieving men, or quickly, bleeding out on the trail. In this telling, he is a tragic hero, a martyr who gave his life for his cause right at the very end. Others whisper a darker tale, that he survived the initial wound, but was assassinated later, a final, quiet act of revenge by the Hatfields to eliminate their most dangerous enemy once and for all. But there is a third version, the one that best explains the empty space where his grave should be. It's the story of a man who simply had enough. He survived his wound, but the war had broken something inside him. He had seen too much killing, had felt too much hate. He looked around and saw that the Union he fought for had won, but his own personal war was a poison that would never stop spreading. And so, he just walked away. He left his life as a guerrilla captain behind, melted back into the mountains he knew so well, and vanished, becoming a ghost of the hollers, a man who chose to erase himself rather than fire another shot. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. With Wall Anderson gone, the Unionist cause in Logan County lost its teeth. Its fiercest protector was gone. Devil Anse Hatfield was now the undisputed power in the valley. The hunt for Harmon McCoy's killers was over. The debt, as far as the law was concerned, was forgotten. But the McCoys did not forget. The fire of vengeance that Wall Anderson had lit was now passed to them, an inheritance of blood that would smolder for years before erupting into the full-blown war that history would remember as the Hatfield-McCoy feud. Even now, a century and a half later, the ghost of William Wall Anderson is still fighting a war in these mountains. His legacy is a battleground. Devil Anse Hatfield's story is complicated, but it's chiseled in stone. Anderson's story, however, is a whisper that changes depending on which side of the hollow you're standing in. His name isn't a historical fact, it's a litmus test for old loyalties that run as deep as the coal seams. If you talk to the descendants of the McCoy family, or those whose ancestors were staunch Unionists, Wall Anderson was a hero, plain and simple. He was the only law that mattered in a lawless time. When the courthouse turned a blind eye to murder, he was the righteous fury that fought back. They'll tell you he was a brave captain who stood up to the brutal partisans led by men like Jim Vance, protecting innocent families from being terrorized. To them, his wildcats were a shield, and he was the wall that gave them their name, the last line of defense against Confederate tyranny. But cross the river. Talk to the families who still take pride in their Confederate roots, whose great-grandfathers rode with Devil Anse. To them, William Anderson was a monster, a marauder. They don't call him a soldier, they call him a bushwhacker who used the chaos of war as a license to plunder and kill. They speak the name snakes with venom, remembering stories passed down of night raids, of stolen livestock, of a fear that their own government-sanctioned protector was a common criminal. In their version of the story, Devil Anse was the true hero, a man defending his home and people from Anderson's murderous gang. So who was he? A patriot or a killer? A lawman or a terrorist? The terrible, unsettling truth is that he was probably both. In a guerrilla war, fought neighbor against neighbor, the line between a soldier and a murderer is often just a shadow on the ground. To the family he was protecting, he was a savior. To the family he was hunting, he was the devil himself. His legacy isn't a single story, but a collection of conflicting, deeply personal truths, all of them held with absolute conviction. He reminds us that the victor may write the history books, but the vanquished write the family stories, and those are the ones that never die. When a man leaves no grave, he can't be buried. And when a story has no ending, it can never truly be over. With the facts of William Anderson's fate lost to time, the storytellers of the mountains took over. The man of flesh and blood died or vanished, but in his place, they created something that could never die. A ghost, a legend. To this day, there are people in these hills who will tell you that Wall Anderson never left. They say his spirit still walks the high ridges that overlook the Tug Fork, forever on patrol. They turn him into a cautionary tale, a boogeyman to scare the young. They say, if you're hunting late in the evening and you hear the snap of a twig behind you, don't turn around too fast. It might be the ghost of the old Union captain, still searching for the men who killed his friend. He has become a haint of the mountains, a restless spirit tied to the land he fought and bled for. This is the final stage in the life of a story like this. It's how a community processes a trauma that has no clean resolution. There was no final justice for Asa Harmon McCoy. There was no known resting place for his avenger. So the people absorbed him into their folklore. The ghost story is a way of remembering, a way of warning that old hatreds don't just disappear. They linger in the soil, in the shadows between the trees. The man is gone, but the grudge remains. And so, Captain William Wall Anderson, the historical figure, has faded almost completely. In his place stands the legend. He is no longer just a man who fought in a war. He is a permanent part of the landscape's psychic terrain, a symbol of a feud so bitter that not even death could end it. He is the whisper in the pines, the unseen fear in the hollow, a ghost born from a real man's quest for vengeance. And so, we end where we began. Standing on this ridge in Logan County, listening to the wind move through the pines. The sound hasn't changed, but after our journey, the silence feels different. It's no longer empty. Now, it's filled with the echoes of a forgotten war. We started with a single name on a faded muster roll and followed it into the heart of a darkness that history tried to forget. We stood at the mouth of a cold cave. We saw the ghost in the empty pages of a courthouse ledger, and we learned how one man's righteous fury could become a law unto itself. The story of William Wall Anderson is the proof that the most famous legends are often built on forgotten foundations. The world remembers the Hatfield-McCoy feud as a story of stolen pigs and star-crossed lovers. But that's the tale, not the truth. The truth began here, with a political assassination and a promise of vengeance. It's a reminder that the great sweeping forces of history are always at their heart intensely personal stories of love, loyalty, and a hatred that can outlive the men who carry it. So the next time you pass a forgotten ruin on a lonely road, remember that it's not just a pile of stones. It's a library filled with stories of the choices that define us. The men who fought here are long gone. The cabins they defended have returned to the earth. The guns have fallen silent. But the story remains.